comrades, Taimur Rahman, one of the leaders of Stalinism in Pakistan and a professor of political theory there, has put out a video, Why I'm Not a Trotskyist. And this video is carried out scathing attack upon Leon Trotsky, the co-leader of the Russian Revolution with Lenin, and his celebrated theory of uninterrupted revolution, the permanent revolution. In his video, he has made a jumble of facts and misinterpretations of the propositions in this theory, and it was pertinent for us to clarify, to clear the fog around those propositions as created by Professor Rahman, and therefore we plan to put it out in a video itself, but it was becoming too long and that would have been boring for the viewer. So finally we have planned to put out these responses, our replies to the assertions of Professor Rahman in a series of videos which would be more interesting and adaptable to our viewers. So in this video in the series, we'll be dealing with one question raised by Professor Rahman, where he asserts that Leon Trotsky stood for an international socialist revolution, that is, a revolution simultaneously taking place in all countries, and Leon Trotsky was opposed to revolution in a single country, that is Russia. He says that Lenin, on the contrary, was for socialist revolution in one country, and he was opposed to the idea of this revolution taking simultaneously in all countries. In this particular video, we will be dealing with the question raised by Professor Rahman as to the character of the socialist revolution internationally and nationally, where he says that Lenin and Trotsky stood in opposition to each other. Professor Rahman says that Leon Trotsky stood for an international socialist revolution and was opposed to revolution in one country. According to him, Lenin, on the contrary, stood for socialist revolution in one country and was opposed to socialist revolution taking place simultaneously in all countries on an international basis. So he pits Lenin against Trotsky on the character of revolution, where according to him, Trotsky was for simultaneous revolution in all countries and Lenin was for revolution, socialist revolution in one country. Now let us come to Russian history, concrete positions of these leaders. In fact, before the rebellion of 1905 in Russia, all leaders of social democracy, from Plekhanov to Axelrod and from Martynov to Martov and Martynov to Lenin, and including Trotsky, they all thought that there can't be a socialist revolution in Russia. They thought that socialist revolution would take place in Europe and Russia would only join it. They thought that the bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia would give spark to Europe. European proletariat would take to socialist revolution, would come to aid of bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia, and then Russia would in turn join the socialist revolution. So this was the concept. To the astonishment of Professor Rahman, in fact, Leon Trotsky was the only leader, was the first leader in Russia to take break from this thought, from this idea. of old social democracy, the European social democracy. Now, Professor Rahman is making allegation against Leon Trotsky of being Eurocentric. But in fact, this idea is Eurocentric, from which Leon Trotsky is taking a break in 1906. In 1906, in his book Results and Prospects, Leon Trotsky has propounded an idea that even before the proletariat of Europe, Russian proletariat would lead a socialist revolution and through it would establish its sole class dictatorship, a socialist dictatorship, followed by peasantry. It was the idea of Leon Trotsky that the Russian proletariat is going to lead a socialist revolution in Russia. At that time, all other leaders were thinking that Russia is mature for a bourgeois democratic revolution because of its backwardness, because of its economic and cultural backwardness, political backwardness. Russia is not mature for a socialist revolution. So socialist revolution cannot take place in Russia. It was Leon Trotsky who in his book Results and Prospects for the first time declared that Russia is mature for a socialist revolution, and it is the backwardness of Russia that would lead to socialist revolution. Proletariat at the head of the peasant masses would achieve the power and would establish its class dictatorship in a socialist revolution. So the first assertion, the very basic assertion of Professor Taimur Rahman, that Leon Trotsky did not stand for socialist revolution in Russia in one country, is totally flawed. In fact, it was none else but Leon Trotsky who stood for socialist revolution in Russia in single country. Lenin and all other leaders at the time until 1917, February 1917, all of them stood for the idea of an international socialist revolution. They thought that socialist revolution would take place internationally, simultaneously in all countries, and not in one country, Russia alone. They were opposed to this idea of a socialist revolution in Russia. It was Leon Trotsky only who had propounded this idea, who had put forward this idea in 1906. So the situation on the ground, the positions of parties, of the leaders of the ground, are just opposite to what Professor Rahman and his Stalinist comrades think. The real position is this, that except Leon Trotsky, no other leader was giving way to the proposition. No other leader was thinking in terms of a socialist revolution in one country before February 1917. The upsurge, the revolution that started in February 1917, taught Lenin, and Lenin was the first leader among Bolsheviks to turn to Leon Trotsky, to his theory of permanent revolution against old Bolshevik formula. And he accepted the position that yes, the revolution that is taking place in Russia can succeed only as a workers' revolution, as a socialist revolution, and succeed only as a dictatorship of the proletariat. So it is not Leon Trotsky, as Professor Rahman says, who was opposed to a socialist revolution in one country, but it were all other Bolshevik leaders, Menshevik leaders, minus Trotsky, who were opposed to this idea, who were vouching for the idea of an international socialist revolution. They all thought that it would be an international socialist revolution. Socialist revolution cannot take place in one country, much less in a backward country like Russia. Professor Rahman is making a huge error. He doesn't know the ABC of Trotskyism. His claim to Trotskyism that he has read Trotskyism with SWP, etc., is false to the core. He doesn't understand the fundamentals of Trotskyism. He doesn't understand Trotsky or his theory. His claim that Trotsky stood for an international socialist revolution in the sense that revolution would be taking place simultaneously in all countries is absolutely incorrect. Trotsky is opposed to this idea. This idea was of old European social democracy. The idea was that if not all, then at least major advanced countries would go simultaneously for a socialist revolution. And this idea had come from Marx himself. It was Marx himself who said that the major advanced countries would rise in revolution, socialist revolution. So this Eurocentric idea was not the idea of Leo Trotsky. Leo Trotsky is opposed to this Eurocentrism. In the new conditions that have come with advent of imperialism at the turn of the century, the 19th century, Leon Trotsky was the first leader to note them. Leon Trotsky was the first leader to consider them. And he developed his theory of permanent revolution on that basis. Leon Trotsky has never said that revolution would take place simultaneously in all countries. Professor Rahman has quoted Lenin against Trotsky. I would quote him. I would re-quote him. He quotes Lenin from his speech of 14th May 1918, where Lenin is in fact rebuking Zinoviev and Kamenev, the ones who led the group that opposed the October Revolution and who were expelled from the party for this reason. Here is the quote. I know that there are, of course, sages who think they are very clever and even call themselves socialists, who assert that power should not have been seized until the revolution had broken out in all countries. They do not suspect that by speaking in this way they are deserting the revolution and going over to the side of the bourgeoisie. To wait until the toiling classes bring about a revolution on an international scale means that everybody should stand stock still in expectation. This is nonsense. This is his speech, Lenin's speech delivered at a joint meeting of the All Russian Central Executive Committee in the Moscow Soviet on 14th May 1918. This is something directed against Zinoviev and Kamenev, the leaders who were expelled from the party for their opposition to the October Revolution. But Professor Rahman attributes it to Lenin against Trotsky. Trotsky has nothing to do with this speech of Lenin. Lenin is rebuking Kamenev and Zinoviev. And even Lenin's wife Krupskaya was opposing this revolution initially. these leaders were in fact adhered to old positions of Bolsheviks even after Lenin had taken the turn towards Trotsky in February 1917. Stalin was supporting February government because of these old positions of Bolsheviks. In fact, Bolsheviks, Lenin included, they were supporting the idea of a bourgeois democracy, a bourgeois republic in Russia. They were expecting a bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia. They were standing for that. They were opposing socialist revolution. They were opposing the idea of a socialist revolution, of workers' dictatorship in Russia. Let me read the quote of Lenin from his book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in Democratic Revolution. Lenin said, Marxists are absolutely convinced of the bourgeois character of the Russian Revolution. This is writing before uprising of 1905. His writing in 1904. Marxists are absolutely convinced of the bourgeois character of the Russian Revolution. What does it mean? It means that the democratic reforms in the political system and the social and economic reforms that have become a necessity for Russia do not in themselves imply the undermining of capitalism, the undermining of bourgeois rule. On the contrary, they will, for the first time, really clear the ground for a wide and rapid European and not Asiatic retarded development of capitalism. They will, for the first time, make it possible for the bourgeoisie to rule as a class. This is what Lenin was saying in 1904. So Lenin was vouching for development of capitalism, a long-time development of capitalism in Russia, at the end of which was to come the socialist revolution. In this, Lenin was not alone. All leaders of social democracy in Russia at the time, they were vouching for a bourgeois democratic revolution. Mensheviks and Bolsheviks both agreed on this, that Russia is not going to have a socialist revolution. That was out of question because of backwardness of Russia in their wisdom. So they all agreed that the revolution that is going to come in Russia was a bourgeois democratic revolution. And a socialist revolution, according to them, was to take place simultaneously in advanced countries, in all advanced countries of Europe. And from there, it would bounce back upon Russia. Russia would join that revolution thereafter. It was Leon Trotsky who presented his thesis and results and prospects and declared that Russia was going to be the first country to have the socialist revolution, have the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the working class. Professor Rahman makes very loud claim to Trotskyism. He makes very loud claim that he had been with the Socialist Workers' Party in the US and he has learnt Trotskyism from Trotsky himself. But as we have said, he knows nothing. He doesn't know even ABC of Trotskyism. And this is not with Professor Rahman only. This is with all Stalinist leaders. They are living under misconceptions and they are distributing these misconceptions, this political myopia, this blindness to their followers, to their viewers, to their audience, to their readers. This is one of the questions, and very important question, as to the character of the revolution. Who stood where? Which leader supported what proposition, what position? So in that we see that it is not Leon Trotsky who is opposing socialist revolution in one country. It is all leaders minus Leon Trotsky who are opposing socialist revolution in one country till February 1917. It was only in February 1917 that Lenin turns towards Trotsky, towards his theory of permanent revolution. He accepts his position that yes, a socialist revolution can take place in Russia. Yes, proletariat can establish its dictatorship in Russia. And in his April thesis, Lenin gives the finished form to a strategy of revolution that is based upon the theory of permanent revolution. In his letters from afar, which were not published by Stalin and Pravda, in those letters, Lenin starts whispering about this new position. He starts opposing the old Bolshevik position. And as he arrives in Russia, he becomes the first-hand witness to the political situation there, to the political events there. He immediately takes a turn towards Trotsky, towards his theory of permanent revolution. He arrives at a conclusion that yes, socialist revolution can take place in one country, and it is already taking place in Russia, and accept a dictatorship, a class dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia, no revolution is going to take place. Revolution is not going to fruition. If it is going to fruition, it is going to fruition only as dictatorship of the proletariat, as a socialist revolution. Under leadership of the proletariat, a dictatorship of the proletariat, followed by peasant mass. So he abandoned his old formula of a combined dictatorship of two classes of proletariat and peasantry also. So the claim of Stalinists that include Professor Rahman, that Trotsky stood for an international socialist revolution taking place simultaneously in all countries, and he opposed the revolution in single country, the socialist revolution in single country, is false to the core, is absolutely incorrect. In fact, Stalinists are intermingling two things. Trotsky was not opposed to socialist revolution in a country. What Trotsky was opposed to, socialism in one country. The idea of right-wingers, the idea first propounded by Bukharin and even before him advocated by Narodniks, that socialist society, socialist culture and socialist economy, socialist social relations can be built in one isolated country, that too in a backward country like Russia. To this idea, Leon Trotsky was opposed to. We will discuss this issue in next video. In this video, we have discussed as to the character of revolution and the disputes among the leaders of Russian Revolution as to this characterization of revolution and the misconceptions that Professor Rahman and other Stalinist leaders are entertaining on this. So let us wait for the next video. Thank you.